200 motorcycles. Not 20, not 50, 200. They lined Sycamore Street from the stop sign at the corner all the way to the dead end by the old grain elevator, bumper to bumper in the pre-dawn dark. Engines cold and silent, chrome catching the first pale hint of light coming up over the Montana hills. It was 4:47 in the morning. The temperature read 11 degrees on the bank sign 3 blocks away, the one that kept blinking even though the bank itself had been closed for 6 months. 200 men and women in leather stood outside a house the size of a double garage. A white house with a sagging front porch and a screen door that had needed replacing for at least a decade. A house where the flower boxes under the windows still held the dried stalks of last summer's marigolds, brown and bent, but somehow still standing. The way certain things refuse to fall even when every reason to stay upright is gone. And in the kitchen of that house, under a light the color of old honey, an 87-year-old woman named Margaret Holloway was making coffee for 200 people who had driven through the night to be there. She didn't have 200 cups, she had 7. She made it work anyway. Before we go back to the beginning, and we have to go back, because none of what you just pictured makes any sense without what came before, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Because this story didn't happen in a movie. It didn't happen on a screen. It happened in Coldwater Creek, Montana, population 1,400 on a Tuesday in November. And by Wednesday morning, it had already changed every single person on that street in ways none of them saw coming, including Margaret herself. Especially Margaret. Stay with me, because the part I haven't told you yet, the part about why 200 strangers drove through a blizzard for a woman they had never met, that part is going to hit you somewhere you didn't expect. The night it started was the kind of night that has no business existing in October. Montana can turn on you fast. Everyone who lives there knows this, and everyone who doesn't learns it the hard way. The forecast had said a few flurries, possible accumulation, temperatures dropping toward midnight. That was the forecast. What actually happened was different. What actually happened was the kind of storm that comes out of Canada with its jaw set and its mind made up. The kind that takes a dry road at 7 in the evening and turns it into a skating rink by 9. Ray Coleman had been riding since 3 in the afternoon. He'd left Billings after the service. Frank Diaz, 3 decades of brotherhood, the man who had stood next to Ray at his wedding, who had shown up at the hospital when Ray's daughter was born, who had called every week without fail, even during the years Ray wasn't calling anyone back. Frank had been buried that morning in the Veterans Cemetery on the south side of Billings, under a gray sky that felt appropriate and terrible at the same time. Ray had stood at the grave until everyone else left. He wasn't ready to go back to the clubhouse and sit with people who wanted to talk, who needed to process, who were going to say Frank's name out loud over and over the way people do after a funeral, like repetition will somehow make it more real. Ray needed the road. That's the thing about riding that people who don't ride never quite understand. It's not about destination. It's about the only state of being in the world where your entire mind has to stay in the present tense. You can't drift when you're on a bike at 70 miles per hour. You can't replay the past or fear the future. You just ride. The road is all there is. For Ray Coleman, who had been riding for 31 years, the motorcycle was the only therapist that ever actually worked. So he rode. He took Route 87 north out of Billings, not because it made geographic sense, but because the road curves through the Musselshell Valley, and at certain times of year, at certain speeds, it makes you feel briefly like the world is still in its right proportions. He rode past the little towns, past Lavina and Rygate and Shawmut, the kind of towns that exist so trucks have somewhere to stop and so people can mark their maps and feel like the land has been named. The sky turned orange and then purple, and then that particular shade of nothing that comes just before full dark. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 40 minutes. Ray felt it through his jacket. He had the cold weather liner in, the good gloves, the neck gaiter, all the gear that 31 years of riding teaches you to never leave without. He wasn't unprepared. But there's a difference between prepared and adequate, and somewhere around the turnoff or roundup, he started to understand that this wasn't just going to be a cold ride home. The snow started around 8, not flurries, not the decorative kind, heavy, wet, horizontal snow that came at him across the valley like it had somewhere to be, and Ray Coleman was in the way. The road disappeared under it in patches, and then in sections, and then almost entirely. His headlight caught nothing but white, his visor fogged. He dropped to 30, then 25, following the yellow line when he could see it, and the center line rumble strip when he couldn't. He was somewhere between Reigate and a place the map called Otter, but that consisted of a grain elevator and a Lutheran church and not much else. When he felt the back wheel go, not dramatically, not a slide or a skid, just a wobble. Subtle, the kind a tire makes when something inside it has given up. Ray had felt that sensation before. He pulled off onto the shoulder, or what he thought was the shoulder. Visibility was down to maybe 30 feet, and got the kickstand down and stood in the snow with his helmet in one hand and looked at the rear tire. Flat. Not a slow leak, completely flat. He stood there for a moment. The snow came at him sideways. He had his phone, but out here the signal was the kind of thing you couldn't count on. One bar that appeared and vanished like it was taunting him. He pulled up the Maps app. The nearest town with anything resembling services was 18 miles back. The temperature on his phone said 22 degrees and it was still dropping. Ray Coleman had been cold before. He knew the difference between cold that's uncomfortable and cold that's serious. The kind that sneaks up on you while you're standing in the wind, too focused on your problem to notice it's actually becoming a different problem. His fingers were going. Not painfully. That was the bad sign. Pain meant the cold hadn't won yet. Numbness meant something else. He had maybe 40 minutes before standing on the side of this road became an emergency. He looked down the road in both directions. Snow. Dark. Nothing. He looked across the field to his left. There was a light. Just one window, maybe 3/4 of a mile off the road, visible through the snow as a faint, warm smear in the dark. A farmhouse maybe. A ranch. Something. He picked up his helmet, took his hands out of the good gloves, tucked them under his arms for 30 seconds to get feeling back in his fingers, and then he started walking. He walked through a field of what had been tall grass and was now crunching snow-covered stubble that reached his knees in places. He walked with his jacket zipped to his chin and his head down. He walked for 15 minutes with the light ahead of him never getting much larger. Always just that faint golden smear, proof that somewhere out there something was still warm and alive. He almost didn't knock. That detail matters, remember it. He got to the porch steps and stood at the bottom and thought about what he looked like. A large man in a black leather jacket with road grime on his face and Iron Ghost MC patches on his chest and a beard that hadn't seen a razor in 10 days. Standing at an old woman's door at 9:30 at night in a blizzard. He thought, she will be terrified. She should be terrified. Any reasonable person would be. He turned to go. That's when the porch light came on. Ray froze. The door opened before he could move. Not just the inner door, the screen door too, which swung outward and nearly hit him in the arm. And there she was, small, barely 5 feet if that, white-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing a wool cardigan over a flannel nightgown and holding, Ray noticed this immediately, not a shotgun, not a phone, not anything defensive at all. Just a cup of tea, like she'd been expecting company. She looked at him for 3 full seconds. "You're going to freeze to death," she said. "Come inside." Not a question, not a hesitation, just a statement of fact and an instruction, delivered in the same tone you'd use to tell someone their shoelace was untied. Ray Coleman, president of the Iron Ghost Motorcycle Club, 52 years old, a man who had stared down people in situations that would make most humans fold. Ray stood there in the snow with his mouth open. "Come on," she said, "I've got soup." Her name was Margaret Holloway, but the few people in Coldwater Creek who still came by called her Maggie. She had lived in this house for 62 years. She and Harold had moved in the spring of 1963, 5 months after their wedding, when Harold had finished adding the second bedroom in preparation for a family that, in the end, God had decided wouldn't happen. The house was small. It had always been small. Harold used to say it was the right size for two people who actually liked each other, which he said was rarer than the square footage implied. Harold had been gone for 11 years. The house was the same. Maggie sat Ray down at the kitchen table, a wooden table with a crack running from one corner that Harold had patched twice with wood glue and that Maggie had never repaired again after he was gone because the crack had his fingerprints in the wood filler, and she wanted to keep that. And she put a bowl of split pea soup in front of him and a plate of bread that she had baked that morning, and she poured him coffee from the percolator on the stove without asking whether he wanted it. Ray wrapped his hands around the mug and felt the heat move up through his palms and into his wrists and up his arms, and he didn't say anything for a while. He just let it happen. The warming, the specific kind of relief that your body gives you when it realizes it's going to be okay. "Thank you," he said finally. "Eat the soup while it's hot," Maggie said. "Thank me after." He ate. She watched, not intrusively, the way older people sometimes watch you eat when they want to see you actually take care of yourself. She asked him eventually where he'd been riding from, and he told her Billings, and she asked why, and he told her. Frank. The funeral. The long ride that became a longer ride that became a flat tire in a field. Maggie looked at the table for a moment. "That's a hard kind of day," she said. "Yeah. Harold's been gone 11 years, she paused. "I still have hard days." Ray looked up from the soup. "You stop expecting them," she said, "and then one comes and knocks you right over." They sat in that kitchen for 2 hours. Ray learned about Harold, the 34 years at the county road department, the vegetable garden that took up half the backyard, the way he'd whistle the same fragment of a song, the first few bars of King of the Road, while he made breakfast every morning without ever seeming to notice he was doing it. Maggie learned about the Iron Ghost MC, not the version people imagined from movies, but the actual version, the one where a bunch of men in their 40s and 50s met on weekends to ride and raised money for veterans' families and organized Christmas toy drives and generally kept an eye on each other the way men who've been through things keep an eye on each other. She learned about Frank, about the way Frank used to call on the anniversary of bad days, not to talk about them, just to talk, because talking about something else is sometimes the only way to get through the thing you can't say out loud. Around midnight, Maggie stood up and said, "You'll sleep in the second bedroom." Not an offer, a decision already made. Ray started to say he could figure something else out, that he didn't want to impose, that once the storm let up. "The storm isn't letting up until morning," Maggie said. "The second bedroom has clean sheets. The bathroom is across the hall. You can figure out your tire when the sun's up." Ray Coleman slept in the second bedroom. Harold's workbench was in there, pushed to one side to make room for a twin bed, still holding the tools Harold had used, hand planes and chisels in a wooden rack, 3 levels hanging on the wall, a coffee can of drill bits, a calendar still showing March 2014. The room smelled of old wood and mineral oil. Ray lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about Frank, and about Harold who he never met, and about the particular stubbornness of things that stay in the world after people leave it. He fell asleep. He didn't mean to stay past breakfast. He'd planned to call for a tire, get back on the road, leave Maggie a proper thank you, and get home. That was the plan. Over eggs and toast, she had a cast iron skillet the size of a hubcap that she moved with one hand like it weighed nothing. Ray asked about the envelope on the counter. He'd noticed it the night before. You notice the things that are wrong in a space, and that envelope was wrong. It sat on the counter by the phone, which was a landline, a corded phone the color of old butter. And the envelope was open, and something in the way it was positioned, propped against the base of the phone, face up, not filed or tucked away, told Ray that it was something being kept in sight as a reminder. Or a threat. The kind of thing you don't put away, because putting it away would mean pretending it wasn't there. He noticed it. He didn't say anything the night before. In the morning, over eggs, he asked. Maggie looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then she refilled his coffee. "That," she said carefully, "is a letter from the bank." Ray waited. She sat down across from him. She folded her hands on the table the way people do when they're deciding how much of the truth to say. 62 years I've been in this house," she said. "Harold and I paid off the mortgage in 1991. Took us 23 years, but we paid it." She paused. "When he got sick, not when he died, before that, when the treatment started, I refinanced. To cover the medical bills, it seemed like the right thing. It seemed like there was no other choice." Ray said nothing. He was listening the way you listen when you understand that the person across from you hasn't been able to say this out loud in a long time. "The payments were manageable when I had Harold's pension and my own Social Security both coming in. After he passed, I had mine and half of his. It was tight, but I managed. And then 2 years ago, the interest rate adjusted." She looked at the envelope. "And then the heating oil went up, and then the roof needed repair, and then—" She stopped. "I got behind. 3 months behind, and then 4, and then—" She didn't finish that sentence. She didn't need to. Ray looked at the envelope, then at Maggie, then at her hands folded neat and still on the table. The hands of someone who has decided not to fall apart, because falling apart won't change the letter. "How long do you have?" he asked quietly. 72 hours, Maggie said, "from yesterday." Ray Coleman sat very still. "I've been trying to figure out where to go," she said. Her voice stayed even. "My neighbor Susan, she's 81. She said I could stay with her, but Susan's daughter is already upset about the situation, and I don't want to—" She stopped again, made herself start again. "I'm not in the habit of burdening people." Ray thought about a woman who had opened her door at 9:30 at night, in a blizzard, to a stranger with biker patches and road grime on his face, who had fed him soup and given him Harold's bedroom and cooked him breakfast without a second thought, saying she didn't want to burden people. He thought about that for a good 30 seconds. Then he pushed back his chair and picked up his phone. The signal out here was still bad. He stepped outside onto the porch. Cold air hit him like a wall, and held the phone at different heights until he got 2 bars and kept them for long enough to make a call. The phone rang 3 times. Ghost. That was Denny. Denny Marsh, vice president, 22 years in the club, a man who could fix anything with an engine, and could also, when necessary, locate a replacement rear tire for a Road King in the middle of rural Montana before noon on a Wednesday. "You're up early," Ray said. "You didn't come home last night," Denny said. "I figured early was appropriate." "I'm fine. I'm in—" He turned back to look at the house, at the frost on the windows, and the dried marigolds in the boxes, and the number 14 on the mailbox that had gone crooked on its post. "I'm in Coldwater Creek. I need a tire. But Denny, before that, I need you to listen to something." He told Denny about Maggie. Denny listened. He was good at listening. When Ray was done, there was a silence on the line, and then Denny said, "How much?" Ray said he didn't know yet. He said he wasn't even sure what could be done. "How much time?" She said 72 hours from yesterday, so 48 hours now, maybe less. Another silence. "Let me make some calls," Denny said. "Don't do anything yet," Ray said quickly. "I don't want to. She didn't ask for anything. She just told me. I don't want to make something out of nothing and then have it not work out and—" "Ray," Denny's voice was quiet. "Let me make some calls." Ray stood on the porch in the cold and looked out at the field he'd walked through the night before. In the daylight, it was just a field, flat and white and ordinary. The road was visible from here, 3/4 of a mile away, and he could see where his bike was, the handlebars just visible above the snow-covered shoulder. He'd walked 3/4 of a mile through a blizzard at 10 below zero and knocked on a stranger's door. He thought about how he'd almost turned back at the porch steps. Almost. Denny called back in 20 minutes. The number, once Denny had dug through the right channels, county records, the loan servicing company, the bank's regional office, was $34,400. $34,400 in back payments and fees and penalties, the kind of number that starts small and then compounds while a woman tries to decide which bill is most important and figures that as long as she keeps making something close to the payment, the system will be patient with her. Which is not how systems work, which is something the system never bothers to explain clearly until it's already too late. $34,000. Ray sat with that number for a moment. Then he called Denny back. "What are you thinking?" Denny asked. "I'm thinking," Ray said, "that I want to do something. I just don't know if there's enough time." There was a pause. "The Iron Ghost has 41 active members," Denny said. 41 brothers. And you've been president for 14 years. If you make a call, Ray, a real call, not a suggestion, a call, they'll answer." Ray looked through the window at Maggie, who was washing the breakfast dishes with her back to him, moving with the careful efficiency of someone who has done this 10,000 times in this exact kitchen, in front of this exact window, watching the exact same stretch of yard. "Make the calls," Ray said. What happened in the next 6 hours is the part the rational mind wants to explain away. The part that sounds like something someone made up, the kind of thing you hear and think, that didn't really happen like that. Things don't actually work that way. But they do sometimes, not often. But sometimes, when the circumstances align and the people involved decide that doing the right thing matters more than doing the comfortable thing, they do. Denny made calls. The calls became calls from those people to other people. Denny had ridden with the Iron Ghost for 22 years, but he'd also ridden with other clubs before that, and alongside other clubs at rallies and charity events, and the kind of slow, long road trips that create friendships between people who might otherwise have nothing obvious in common. He called 3 men. Those 3 men each called 3 more. By 1 in the afternoon, 18 people had committed. By 2:30, 36. By 4, when the sun was already getting low and thin over the western hills, a man named Carlos Garcia, who rode with a club out of Great Falls, called Denny back and said, "How many people do you need?" The money question was where it got complicated. Denny had spent the afternoon on the phone with a man named Steve Pollard, who was not only an Iron Ghost member and the owner of a transmission repair shop in Billings, but also, as it turned out, and this is the kind of detail that seems too convenient until you remember that life is not, in fact, a movie, and convenience is just another word for paying attention. Steve Pollard had spent 3 years working in mortgage servicing before a midlife crisis, and the used Harley had redirected his career trajectory entirely. Steve knew foreclosure law. More specifically, Steve knew Montana foreclosure law, which requires a specific number of notice days and a specific process before a property can be seized, and which, he told Denny with the focused energy of a man who has found a problem he can actually solve, had potentially not been followed correctly in this case. "The letter says 72 hours, Steve said. "That's not necessarily legal. Let me look at the actual filing." By 3 in the afternoon, Steve had looked at the actual filing. By 3:15, he was on the phone with Maggie, asking her to read him the exact language from the documents. By 3:45, he was doing things on his laptop that Ray, sitting at Maggie's kitchen table, couldn't follow, but that Maggie was watching with the expression of someone seeing something shift that she had resigned herself to staying fixed. They made a procedural error, Steve told Ray quietly, stepping outside. The 60-day cure notice wasn't properly served. They sent it to an old address, not the property address. That doesn't kill the foreclosure, but it means we have grounds to delay. Maybe a lot of delay, depending on the judge. Ray thought about what Denny said. 41 brothers, and the other calls, and Carlos Garcia asking how many people they needed. "What if the delay isn't necessary?" Ray said. "What if we just pay it?" Steve looked at him. $34,000. "Yeah." Steve was quiet for a moment. "You know how many people Denny's called today?" Ray didn't actually know. He'd been inside with Maggie, who had at some point stopped pretending she wasn't aware that something was happening and had begun sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, not speaking, just being in the room, while Ray made calls and Denny's calls bounced back to Ray, and the number of people who knew about a White House in Coldwater Creek grew and grew. "As of 4 o'clock, Steve said carefully, "the answer to your question about whether we can pay it is yes. We're past yes, There's already enough. Ray stood on the porch with the phone in his hand, and the last of the afternoon light going gold over the snow-covered field. He hadn't cried at Frank's funeral. He'd stood at the grave and held it together, because that was what the day required. Because Frank would have found weeping undignified, and because Ray was the president, and presidents hold the space for other people to fall apart in. He'd ridden for 5 hours with the grief sitting on his chest like a stone, and he'd stood in a blizzard with a flat tire, and walked through a field and knocked on a door he'd almost turned away from. He stood on the porch and felt something shift in his chest. He didn't cry, but it was close. By 6 in the evening, the number of people driving toward Coldwater Creek had passed 100 and was still rising. That needs a moment. 100 people. 100 people who had received a phone call that afternoon about a woman they did not know, in a town most of them had never been to, facing a problem they had no personal stake in, were currently getting on motorcycles or into trucks in the gathering dark of a Montana November evening, and pointing themselves toward a set of coordinates that Denny had texted out with a message that said only, "Brother needs us. Come if you can." They came. Maggie didn't know about any of this yet. Ray had kept it from her deliberately, partly because he wasn't sure it would work, wasn't sure even by 6 o'clock that what Denny had said was real, and partly, more honestly, because he'd watched Maggie all day and he understood something about her that he hadn't articulated yet, but that sat in him like a warm coal. That this woman had been carrying this alone for a long time. That the habit of carrying things alone had become structural for her, had become the way she moved through the world, and that the offer of help, given too bluntly or too early, might be the thing that broke her composure in a way she wouldn't want broken. He was waiting for the right moment. He didn't know the right moment would find him first. At 7 in the evening, Maggie looked up from the book she was reading, a thick paperback mystery, read enough times that the spine was white at the creases, and said, without preamble, "You've been making phone calls all day." Ray looked at her. "I can hear you," she said. "The walls are not that thick." "I know. What have you been doing?" Ray set down his coffee. He looked at the table. He looked at the crack in the wood with Harold's fingerprints in the wood filler. "Some people," he said carefully, "are driving out here to help." Maggie looked at him. Her expression didn't change, exactly, but something in it shifted. The same shift you see in a face when it's making a decision about whether to let something in. "How many people?" she said. Ray had texted Denny 10 minutes ago. He knew the answer. He said it. Maggie put down her book. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Ray started to worry, that he'd misread this, that she'd be upset, that the scale of it would feel like too much, like intrusion, like strangers deciding her life for her. Then she said, "I'm going to need more coffee." That was how they ended up at the table together for the second night, making a list. Not a list of sorrows, she wasn't that kind of woman, but a practical list. How many cups did she have? Whether there was more bread, whether the old percolator could handle what was coming. Ray offered to drive to the store. Maggie said the store would be closed and that she had flour and she could make more bread and it would take an hour. And Ray said he would help, and she said she'd believe that when she saw it, and they made 4 loaves of bread in Harold's kitchen, while outside the temperature dropped again, and the first headlights appeared on the road at the edge of the field. They came in the dark, there's no other way to say it. They came in the dark and in the cold, 1 set of headlights, and then 2, and then 5, and then too many to count from the front window, where Maggie stood with a dish towel in her hands, and watched the road fill up like something out of a dream she hadn't known she was waiting to have. The Iron Ghost came first, 41 men and women in black leather, organized and quiet, who parked in formation on the street and walked up the path to Maggie's door with the careful respect of people at a ceremony. Denny came first, actually. Denny, who is 6'4" and built like a side-by-side refrigerator, who took off his helmet at the porch steps and held it against his chest like a hat at a church door, and who, when Maggie opened the door, said simply, "Ma'am, I'm Denny. Ray speaks very highly of you." And Maggie, who had been composed all day, who had held together through the letter and the timeline and the knowing of what was coming with the practiced quietness of a woman who has weathered things before. Maggie looked at Denny and said, "You drove a long way." "Not far enough," Denny said. The others came behind the Iron Ghost, clubs from Great Falls and Missoula and Helena, clubs whose names Ray only half knew, connected by the chain of calls that Denny had set off that afternoon. They parked wherever there was room, on the street, on the shoulder, 3 blocks back where the pavement gave out and became gravel. Some had ridden 4 hours. One group of 7 had come from across the Idaho border, 5.5 hours on roads that were still partly iced. They didn't ask for anything. They didn't need to be organized or directed. They stood in the street in the cold and talked quietly among themselves. And the ones nearest the house stamped their feet against the temperature and looked up at the lit windows and felt something that didn't have a clean name. The thing that happens when you go somewhere that matters just because it matters, and you didn't have to be asked twice. Steve Pollard had driven the bank documents in a folder under his arm. He also had checks. That detail is important. He had a check from the Iron Ghost's emergency fund, a check that a dozen members had personally written and added to the fund in the 6 hours since Denny made the calls. And alongside those, a printout of the online donations that had started coming in when someone, Steve wouldn't say who, though everyone had a theory about Denny, had posted a short version of the story to 3 biker community Facebook groups with a total following of about 200,000 people at 3:30 in the afternoon. By 7 that evening, the online total was $28,000. By midnight, it was $51,000. Steve sat at Maggie's kitchen table with the documents and a laptop and a legal pad, and he walked her through every number. $34,400 in total arrears and fees. With the procedural error he'd identified, they had strong grounds for a delay, possibly a dismissal of the current filing, meaning the bank would have to restart the process if they chose to pursue. But the cleaner solution, the permanent solution, was to settle the arrears entirely, which they could now do. Maggie sat across from Steve and read every number twice. She had been a bookkeeper before she and Harold had moved out here. She understood numbers, and she read them carefully, and she didn't sign anything until she understood it. Steve answered every question, slowly and completely, without ever making her feel rushed. Outside, 200 people stood in the cold. Inside, a woman who had not burdened anyone signed a document that meant she could stay in her house. Ray was standing by the window when it happened. He saw it on Maggie's face. Not a dramatic collapse, not weeping, just a stillness that moved through her like a wave, from her shoulders down into her hands, the way a person looks when a weight leaves them that they've been carrying so long they'd forgotten the carrying was optional. She looked at the crack in the kitchen table, the crack with Harold's fingerprints in the wood filler. "He would have liked you," she said to Ray. "Harold, he always said the people who mattered were the ones who fixed things with their hands." Ray thought about Denny, who'd fixed the tire at noon, about Steve, who'd spent 6 hours fixing the paperwork, about Carlos Garcia, who'd driven from Great Falls at -15 in the dark just because he was asked. "Yeah," Ray said. "I think Harold and I would have gotten along." By 4 in the morning, most of the crowd had settled into a quiet that felt like vigil. People sat on bikes or leaned against them, talking low. Some had brought food. Someone produced a cooler with sandwiches. Someone else had a thermos of something hot that got passed down the line. There was a group near the grain elevator who had started a small fire in a barrel, legally or otherwise, around which a rotating cast of people warmed their hands and talked. Maggie had come out twice with the small cups, 7 of them, and those had been passed and refilled from the percolator she'd run 8 times through the night. She had run out of actual coffee at 2 in the morning and switched to what she called the backup, which was a tin of instant that Harold had bought in 2009 and that tasted, as one Iron Ghost member said politely, like it remembered being coffee. Nobody cared. Just before 5, the sky started to change. The deep black at the eastern horizon went first, turning the color of old bruises, purple and blue, and then lighter, gray-purple, and the outlines of things came back. The grain elevator, the bare cottonwoods along the creek that gave the town its name, the long double row of motorcycles stretching down Sycamore Street. Maggie came out onto the porch at 5:12. She was wearing her wool cardigan over her nightgown and her boots that she'd bought in 2003 and that still had good soles because she'd never seen the sense in throwing away a thing that still worked. She held a cup of the backup coffee. She stood on the porch and looked out at the street. 200 people looked back. And then they started. Not at once, not in any organized way. Just one person and then another. They started their engines. One by one, and then in clusters, and then all together. The Harleys and the Yamahas and the Indians and the Hondas and the 3 guys from Missoula on BMWs who took gentle ribbing about it all night. They started, and the sound built from silence to a rumble, and from a rumble to a roar. And the sound moved through the street and up into the pre-dawn sky, and shook the frost from the cottonwood branches, and rolled out over the fields where the grass was frozen, and the tire tracks from the night before had hardened into small ridges in the snow. Maggie stood on her porch, and her hand went to her mouth. Ray stood beside her. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the sound wasn't already saying. 200 engines, for one woman who opened a door. After a few minutes, the sound softened as people began to throttle back, and in the quiet that came after, Maggie lowered her hand from her mouth. She straightened. She looked at the street the way she had stood at the window looking at the road the night before, with the expression of someone seeing something they hadn't known was possible. Harold would have wanted to ride, she said finally. Ray laughed. Unexpected, real. Did he ever ride? No, but he would have wanted to. She looked at the motorcycles. He wanted to do a lot of things. He just always made sure other people got to do them first. She went inside to make more coffee. Real coffee. She'd found a backup to the backup. And Ray stood on the porch and watched the street and thought about Frank, who was 3 days in the ground, and Harold, who had been gone 11 years, and the ways the dead stay present in the things they built, and the doors they opened, and the habits of hospitality they left behind in the people who loved them. The sun came up at 7:14. By then, most people had left, the way they'd come, quietly, in ones and twos and small groups, back onto the highway and toward their own cities and their own lives. A few stayed longer, until the coffee was done and the bread was gone, and by 8:30 the street was mostly empty, and the only evidence that 200 people had spent the night there was the long line of frost-free rectangles on the pavement where the bikes had stood. The bank received Steve Pollard's paperwork at 9:05 that morning. The payment cleared at 11:40. The foreclosure proceeding was formally closed at 2 in the afternoon, which is when Steve called Maggie and told her, and Maggie said thank you in a voice that held everything she hadn't said in front of all those people. And Steve said, yes, ma'am, the way you say it, when you want someone to know it was your honor. That evening, Maggie Holloway sat at Harold's kitchen table and ate soup, split pea, the same soup she'd given Ray 2 nights before, and she looked at the crack in the table and the dried marigolds in the window box and the percolator on the stove and the envelope that was no longer on the counter because there was no more need for it to be there. Outside, the street was quiet. The frost had come back to the pavement. Everything was the same as it had been. Except that somewhere in Billings, in a house in a regular neighborhood, Ray Coleman was at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at his phone. He'd gotten 17 texts in the past hour from people he didn't expect. Guys he hadn't talked to in years. One person he'd had a legitimate falling out with in 2019. All saying something in the vicinity of the same thing. That they'd heard what happened. That they were glad he'd done it. That they wanted him to know. And in the last text, from a number he had to look up before he recognized it, was 4 words from a man who'd ridden from Idaho in the dark and hadn't said much when he got there. Frank would have come. Ray read it twice. He put down the phone. He sat in the quiet of his kitchen. And finally, 3 days after the funeral, he cried. Not for long, not dramatically, just long enough. Then he poured more coffee and picked up the phone and called Denny because there was a toy drive to organize for December, And because Frank always ran the toy drive and someone was going to have to figure out how to do it without him. And because the thing about grief is that it has to be held and then set down, held and then set down. And the setting down is easier when there is something to do next. That's the thing about people who ride. They don't stop. They keep moving, not to outrun what's behind them, but because motion is how they stay connected to the present, to the road, to the person in front of them and the one behind. The funeral is real. The flat tire is real. The blizzard is real. And the light in the window is real. And the woman who opens the door without asking first is the realest thing of all. Maggie sent a card to the Iron Ghost Clubhouse in Billings 3 weeks later. A plain card, blue, with no printed message. She wrote in the careful handwriting of someone who learned penmanship before the world decided it didn't matter. Thank you for coming. There's always soup. M. Holloway, 14 Sycamore Street. Denny pinned it to the board by the clubhouse door. It was still there the last time anyone checked. The dried marigolds in Maggie's window boxes are still there too. She says she'll replant them in spring. She says it every winter, and every spring she does. If you've ever driven past a house and wondered about the person inside, if you've ever been the stranger at the door and weren't sure whether to knock, if you've ever been the one with the porch light on, waiting for something you couldn't have named, then you already know what this story is about. You knew it before I started telling it. The world has more Maggies in it than you think. More people holding together, alone, in houses full of someone else's tools and someone else's fingerprints in the wood, getting through the days because what else do you do? And the world has more Rays, more people who almost turned back at the porch steps. Almost. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, not the cleaned up version, the actual version, where people are cold and tired and grieving and still show up, where the right moment is never obvious until you're already in it, where the door opens before you even have to knock. Comment and tell me where you're watching from, because I want to know how far the light travels. And share this one with someone who might need to be reminded that knocking is always worth it, that the world contains strangers who will make you soup, that 200 people will drive through the dark for someone they've never met if you just make the call. One phone call. That's where it started. One man who almost walked away from a porch. And a woman who left her light on. Some things you need to know about Ray Coleman before this story makes complete sense. He did not become the president of the Iron Ghost Motorcycle Club because he was the loudest person in the room. In 22 years of membership and 14 of leadership, Ray had never once raised his voice at a club meeting. He didn't need to. There was something in the way Ray went still when a situation required stillness, a quality of absolute attention, of being completely present, that was more authoritative than volume. His daughter once described it by saying her father listened the way other people talked. Like he meant it. He was 52 years old and had spent 31 of those years on a motorcycle. He'd gotten his first bike at 21, a beat-up Sportster that cost him $300 and took him 4 months to get running, and he'd ridden it for 7 years before it finally and conclusively gave up. By then, he had 2 more bikes lined up in the garage. He'd been a mechanic for most of his working life. Not just motorcycles, everything. Cars and trucks and equipment. And there was something about the relationship between a person and a machine that made sense to him in a way people alone sometimes didn't. Machines were honest. They either worked or they didn't. They told you when something was wrong. They didn't pretend. People were messier. Frank Diaz had been the exception. They'd met in 1993 at a rally outside of Bozeman, which Ray had attended with a group of friends who weren't in a club and didn't particularly want to be. And Frank had been there with 2 other men who were prospecting for a small local club that no longer exists. Ray and Frank had ended up at the same campfire, over the same terrible coffee, at 11:30 at night, and they'd talked until 3 in the morning about nothing consequential. About engines and roads, and the specific satisfaction of a long, empty stretch of highway when everything is running right. And by the end of it, Ray had felt that particular thing you feel maybe a handful of times in your life, the thing that tells you, This person is going to matter. Frank mattered for 29 years. He was there when Ray's marriage fell apart, not with commentary or advice, but with a phone call at 10:30 every Thursday night for 8 months, never mentioning the divorce, always ending with, "You riding this weekend?" He was there when Ray's daughter was born, standing in the waiting room with a paper cup of hospital coffee, wearing the iron ghost vest like armor against a world that could take things away from you. Because the club was what you wore when you needed to remind yourself you weren't alone. He was there at every difficult juncture of Ray's life with the same quality that Ray himself possessed, a total, patient, present attention, and the understanding that showing up was usually more important than knowing what to say when you got there. Frank had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in February. By October, he was gone. 8 months, which is both a long time and no time at all. Ray had spent those 8 months making the drive to Billings every week, sometimes twice, sitting in Frank's kitchen or his hospital room, or, on the good days in August, on Frank's back porch where they could see the bear tooths, and doing what Frank had always done for him, being present, being there, not trying to fix the unfixable. The funeral was on a Thursday. Ray drove back to the grave after everyone else had left, and stood there until he felt like he could move again, which took a long time. The riding helped. It always helped. He just hadn't counted on the blizzard. What you have to understand about Maggie Holloway is that she had not been passive about her situation. That word, passive, would have insulted her, and rightly. She had been fighting, in the quiet, methodical way she had fought everything in her life, since the first missed payment 18 months ago. She had called the bank. She had written letters. She had researched options online with a careful, if slow, persistence, using the laptop her neighbor Susan's daughter had set up for her 2 years ago, and that she used primarily for 2 purposes: email to her cousin in Missoula and searching for information she needed. She had searched for information about loan modifications. She had searched for foreclosure assistance programs. She had found a HUD housing counselor and spoken to a very kind young woman named Alicia, who had walked her through the options and who had done everything possible within the limits of what a housing counselor could do, which, in the end, was not quite enough. The numbers were the numbers. $34,400 had accumulated with the patient inexorability of compound interest, and there was no program for an 87-year-old widow in rural Montana that could make those numbers go away. She had considered selling. Harold's tools were still on the workbench in the second bedroom. His levels were still on the wall. The crack in the kitchen table was still there. She had decided not to sell. The letter from the bank had arrived 6 days before Ray walked through the blizzard. Not a letter she hadn't seen before. There had been others, escalating in tone. But this one had a different weight to it, a legal weight, a finality. She had read it 3 times, sitting at the kitchen table in the afternoon light, and then she had propped it against the base of the phone and not moved it. Because not moving it was a kind of honesty she owed herself. The thing existed. Pretending otherwise was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had called her neighbor Susan, and Susan had offered immediately, generously, with the uncomplicated warmth of 50 years of friendship, to let Maggie stay. Maggie had said she would think about it. She had spent the next 5 days being very busy. She cleaned things that didn't need cleaning. She organized the pantry. She baked bread. She watered the houseplants with a thoroughness that suggested she was trying to give them enough for a long time. The night Ray showed up, she had been sitting up later than usual. She knew she should sleep. Sleep was sensible. But the house was quiet in a way that felt different from its usual quiet. Freighted, like a room before an announcement, and she had found herself unwilling to leave the kitchen, the one lit room, the room where Harold had drunk his morning coffee for 34 years. Where she could put her hands on the table and feel the crack in the wood and the warmth of the percolator and the reality of things that were still here. When the porch light triggered, she'd had a motion sensor put in 4 years ago after Harold's tools were stolen from the garage. She never left the porch light on at night otherwise. She'd stood up from the table without really deciding to. Just stood up and went to the door. the way you do things when instinct outpaces thought. She'd seen him through the window first, the shape of him, large and dark and motionless on the bottom porch step, with his back partly turned, as if he was leaving. She'd opened the door anyway. She knew what she was looking at. She could see the patches on his jacket. She watched enough television to understand what motorcycle clubs were, or what they were supposed to be. Harold had watched a documentary once about the Hells Angels and had said afterward, "I think that's mostly theater," which she had thought at the time was Harold-ishly optimistic, and which she now, looking at the frozen man on her porch step, thought might have been exactly right. He was shaking, not trembling, shaking. The deep involuntary kind that means the body's heat regulation systems are working hard. His hands, when she saw them, were red and the joints were white. His face was the color and texture of someone who has been outside in the cold too long. She had made a decision in approximately 1 second. If there was math involved in the decision, it was this. The possible downside of letting a cold stranger into her kitchen was substantially outweighed by the certain downside of watching a man freeze to death on her porch step. That calculation, once made, was final. Maggie Holloway had not survived 87 years by second-guessing herself. The thing about Harold's second bedroom that Ray noticed in the morning, and it's the kind of thing you notice when you've spent the night in a room that belongs, in some spiritual sense, to someone who isn't there, was that it was not preserved like a museum. It was not a shrine. The tools on Harold's workbench were organized, not frozen in time, and there was a thin layer of dust on some surfaces, but not on others, which meant Maggie came in here. Not to remember in the active way of grief, but in the practical way of someone who uses the room, who lives in the whole house, who has decided that a room being empty of a person doesn't mean it should be empty of purpose. The calendar still showing March 2014 was the only thing that might have counted as preservation. Ray lay in bed and looked at it in the early light, the kind of pale gray light that comes before sunrise in Montana in November, and read the month's entries in a handwriting that wasn't Maggie's. Oil change, county road meeting, call plumber. Normal life, recorded in the handwriting of a man who expected the next month to arrive and didn't know it wasn't going to. Ray had a thought he couldn't quite articulate that morning, something about how the ordinary notations of ordinary life were the most heartbreaking thing. Not the dramatic moments, but the oil change written in pen on a Tuesday in March, the presumption of continuation. He got up and folded the blankets. He didn't know why he folded the blankets. Old habit, maybe, or the instinct to leave things better than you found them. He did it with the care of someone who is aware they're a guest in a particular kind of room. The ride that brought 200 people to Coldwater Creek was not, in the end, primarily about money. The money was essential. It was the mechanism, the lever that actually moved the problem. But if you had asked any of the 146 people who actually came, not 200 exactly, that was the figure that circulated in the news coverage, which rounded up, as news coverage does, but Steve counted the actual people and got 146. Why they came, the money would not have been the first thing any of them said. What they would have said, and what several of them did say, to reporters who showed up 2 days later when the story got out, was something about showing up. About the call coming in and not being able to think of a reason not to go. About hearing someone say, "Brother needs us," and understanding that the word brother, in this context, was being applied generously, was being extended to a woman who didn't ride and had never been to a rally and had no particular connection to any of them, and finding that the extension made complete sense, that it was, in fact, the only way the word was supposed to work. A man named Bobby Sykes, who had ridden down from a town called Havre in the very northern part of Montana, a 5-hour ride in the dark in November, said it this way when a local TV camera found him warming his hands by the barrel fire at 3 in the morning. "She opened her door for a brother I've never met. That means she's already done more for us than we're doing for her." That got played on the 11 o'clock news 3 days later, and then clipped and shared about 90,000 times. Bobby Sykes is 57 years old and works at a grain elevator in Havre and has been riding for 20 years and had never been on television before in his life. And when his daughter texted him a screenshot of his quote on a national news website, he stared at his phone for a while and then put it down and went back to his coffee and didn't really know what to say about it. The media coverage deserves its own moment. The story got out because a woman named Janet Poole, who lived 3 houses down from Maggie on Sycamore Street, and who had been watching the motorcycles arrive from her front window with escalating bewilderment since 11 at night, had taken photos on her phone and posted them to a local Facebook group called Coldwater Creek Community Board at 2:15 in the morning with the caption, "Does anyone know what's happening at the Holloway house?" The post got 47 responses in 20 minutes, most of them variants of "no idea" and "I can see the lights from my place." And then someone who knew Maggie, a woman who had been in Maggie's book club before the book club dissolved because 3 of the 4 members had moved or died, posted what she knew about the foreclosure situation, which wasn't much, but was enough. And Janet Poole screenshotted that comment and shared it to her personal feed with the caption, "200 bikers showed up to stop an 87-year-old widow from losing her home. This is happening right now on my street." It was seen by 40 people immediately, then 400, then 4,000. By the time Maggie came out on her porch at 5:12 and the engine started, Janet Poole's post had been shared 11,000 times. And the story had been picked up by 2 regional news aggregators and was working its way, in the slow hydraulic way that things travel on the internet, toward the national news cycle. By Thursday morning, there were satellite trucks on Sycamore Street. Maggie handled this with the same composure she handled everything. She gave one interview to the local CBS affiliate, standing on her porch in the wool cardigan. The reporter was 26 and nervous and asked his questions carefully, and Maggie answered them in complete sentences that required no editing, because Maggie had been raised in an era that expected complete sentences and never unlearned the expectation. The reporter asked her what she had thought when she first saw the motorcycles arriving. Maggie thought for a moment. "I thought," she said, "that Harold would have wanted to count them." The reporter said, "And what did you think when you saw all of them lined up on your street?" Maggie looked at Sycamore Street, at the places on the pavement where the frost-free rectangles were already fading as the day warmed. "I thought," she said, "that people are better than we usually remember." That clip ran on 3 national networks. The money raised online ultimately totaled $67,000. The first $34,400 went to settle the mortgage arrears and close the foreclosure. Steve Pollard handled this personally, charged nothing for his legal work, and told Ray when it was done that it was the best 6 hours he had ever spent with a law degree. After consultation with Maggie, the remaining $32,600 was used for 2 purposes. The first was a roof repair. The roof had needed work for 2 years and had been the beginning of the financial cascade, a repair Maggie had put off because she didn't have the money, which led to water damage in the back bedroom in the spring, which had required additional repairs, which had eaten further into the margin she no longer had. The roofers came on the first clear day in December, 3 of them. One was a member of the Iron Ghost. The second purpose was an emergency fund deposited into a new account that Steve helped Maggie set up, with provisions that meant she could access it for home maintenance and utility emergencies. But that was structured at Maggie's specific request, so that it couldn't be used to pay anyone back. Not the club, not the people who donated online. She didn't want it used that way. She wanted it to stay in the house, which was another way of saying she wanted it to stay with Harold. There was discussion about a named fund, a scholarship, or a local grant, something that would put Maggie's name on something permanent. Maggie declined. "I'm a private person," she said to Steve, in a tone that indicated the conversation was over. Steve told Ray about this later. Ray laughed. "She opens her door to a frozen biker at 9:30 at night," he said, "but a scholarship fund is too public." "She's a private person," Steve said. "She is," Ray agreed. And there was something in his voice when he said it. Not amusement exactly, but something close to admiration of the particular kind that you feel for people who know exactly who they are. What happened to Ray Coleman after Coldwater Creek was both nothing and everything. Nothing changed in the obvious senses. He went back to Billings. He went back to his garage, his house, his life. The Iron Ghosts met the following Saturday, and there was a meeting, and they planned the December toy drive, which was going to be different this year because Frank wasn't there to run it, and they were going to have to figure out how to do it without him, which they did, because you figure these things out. But something had shifted in the way people who knew Ray talked about him, which was a subtle thing and hard to describe. He had always been respected. He had always been trusted. What changed was something harder to name. A quality of being known more fully, of having been seen doing the thing that mattered, the private thing that started with a phone call in the cold before anyone was watching. The Iron Ghost had always known who Ray was. Now they also knew what he did when nobody was watching, which is a different kind of knowledge. His daughter called him the week after. "I saw the news thing," she said. "Yeah. Was it strange? Having all those cameras?" "I wasn't there for most of it," Ray said. "I was inside, eating bread." His daughter laughed. She had her father's quality of stillness over the phone. "Dad," she said after a moment, "why'd you knock on her door?" Ray thought about the porch steps, about turning to go, about the porch light. "She left the light on," he said. A pause. "That's it?" "That's it." His daughter was quiet for a moment. Then, Frank would have approved. Ray sat with his coffee and the winter light coming through the kitchen window, and he thought about that. About Frank, who always called on the hard days just to talk about something else. About Harold, who had fixed the crack in the table twice and whose fingerprints were still in the wood filler. About the ways people leave themselves behind in the things they build and the habits they pass on and the doors they keep open even after they're gone. Yeah, he said, he would have. Maggie Holloway planted new marigolds in the window boxes in April. She sent a photo to Ray, who was not on social media, but who had given her his email address before he left Coldwater Creek that November morning, after the tire was fixed and the paperwork was signed and there was no longer any reason to stay except the reasons that exist between people who have spent 2 nights at a kitchen table talking about the people they've lost. The photo showed the window boxes full of yellow and orange, the kind of marigolds that don't know about winter, that just grow. She wrote, "Harold always said marigolds were optimistic flowers. I think he was right. M." Ray saved the email in a folder he hadn't had before. He named the folder Coldwater Creek. He's been back twice since then. Once in June, when a group of Iron Ghost members did a weekend ride through that part of Montana, and Maggie's house happened to be on the route, which was not an accident. She made soup. Once in October, alone, on the anniversary of Frank's funeral. He took the same road, the same turns. He parked in front of the house with the number 14 on the mailbox. He sat on the porch with Maggie, and they drank coffee, and didn't talk about Frank directly, just about the road and the weather and how the new roof was holding up. When he left, she stood on the porch and watched him go, the way she'd watched the street fill up with motorcycles in November. With the expression of someone who has decided that the world contains enough goodness to be worth trusting. He didn't turn back to look. He didn't need to. He already knew the light was on. There is one more thing worth telling. In January, 2 months after the night of the 200 motorcycles, a man drove up to 14 Sycamore Street on a Tuesday afternoon in a Chevy pickup that had seen better decades. He knocked on the door. He was 63, gray-bearded, wearing a work jacket with a plumbing supply company logo on it, and he had a paper bag with a loaf of bread in it and an expression that suggested he had practiced what he was going to say and now couldn't remember any of it. Maggie opened the door. "I saw you on the news," the man said. "I live over in Hardin. I saw the story and I—" He stopped, held out the bread. "I just wanted to bring something." Maggie looked at the bread, at the man, at the truck in her driveway with the slightly rust-eaten wheel wells. "Come in," she said. "I've got coffee." His name was Dale. He'd lost his own house in a foreclosure 11 years earlier, during the 2008 crisis, a ranch outside of Hardin that had been in his family for 3 generations. He'd never quite recovered from it, not financially, which had eventually more or less sorted itself out, but in the interior sense, the sense in which a place becomes part of who you are, and its loss becomes a kind of permanent subtraction. He had watched the news story from his apartment in Hardin and felt something dislodge in his chest, something he had kept wedged in there for 11 years. He sat at Maggie's kitchen table and drank her coffee, and they talked for 2 hours. He came back the next Tuesday, and the one after that. By March, he was fixing her back fence, which had needed fixing since the fall. And by April, he was helping with the garden. And by July, this is the part Maggie has never told to the news, the part she considers entirely private, the part that is between herself and Harold, and whatever it means when a woman who has been alone for 11 years allows the kitchen to hold 2 cups of coffee again. By July, Dale's truck was in the driveway twice a week, and the marigolds were blooming, and the house at 14 Sycamore Street had settled back into the rhythm of a place that is fully, completely inhabited. Harold's fingerprints are still in the wood filler in the crack on the kitchen table. That's not going anywhere. But the table has new conversations on it now. New cups, new coffee rings on the old wood, new ordinary notations of ordinary life, the kind that presume continuation, the kind that are optimistic the way marigolds are. Ray doesn't know about Dale yet. Maggie will tell him when he comes back in October. She's already planning the soup. There is something the coverage got wrong, though. Something the clipped quote and the 11 o'clock news version and the Facebook shares didn't quite capture, because it was too slow and too quiet to fit into the format. The thing they got wrong was the timeline of the moment. Everyone reported it as, man gets stranded, woman takes him in, man repays kindness with army of bikers. The structure of a fairy tale or a feel-good social media post, inciting event, action, resolution. Clean. 60 seconds of the good news segment before the anchor moves on. But the actual timeline had gaps in it that the coverage smoothed over. Ray did not immediately call Denny when he found out about the foreclosure. He sat with the information for an hour first. He ate eggs. He thought about Harold's calendar. He thought about Maggie standing at the sink with her back to him, doing dishes with the exact same movements she'd probably been doing for 60 years in that exact kitchen. And he thought about the specific dignity of that, of someone continuing to do ordinary things well, even when extraordinary things are happening underneath. He thought about Frank, who had shown up for him at the hardest moments, not with solutions, but with presence, who had called every Thursday not to fix things, but to make sure Ray knew someone was paying attention. He sat with the information for an hour, and he thought, I can be the kind of person who leaves, or I can be the kind of person who stays. That was the whole decision. That's where the story actually turned. Not in a dramatic moment, not in a speech. In a man sitting at a kitchen table in a house he'd wandered into out of a blizzard, deciding what kind of person he wanted to be. He called Denny. Here's what I want to leave you with, and then I want you to think about it for a while after this is over. Most people who have ever been kind, really kind, in the inconvenient way, the costly way, the way that requires something from you that you didn't have to give. Most people who have done that will tell you the same thing if you ask them about the moment of decision. They didn't feel brave. They didn't have a plan. They just couldn't think of a good reason not to. Ray almost walked away from the porch. Maggie opened the door before he could. 200 people drove through the dark because someone sent a text that said, "Brother needs us." Dale brought bread to a stranger's house because he watched the news and felt something move. None of them had a reason. They just couldn't find a reason not to. That's all it is. That's the whole architecture of it. The absence of a reason not to. The moment when the easier thing and the right thing diverge, and you stand on the porch step in the blizzard, and you either turn back toward the road, or you raise your hand to knock. Knock. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. Not because the algorithm needs it, though it does, but because it means the next time a story like this one finds its way to you, you'll be here for it. Hit the bell, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because I've been keeping track, and this story has now found its way to 41 countries, which is the most surprising and least surprising thing I can imagine. And if you know a Maggie, someone carrying something heavy and quietly, Someone who keeps the light on even when there's no particular reason to. Go knock on the door. Bring soup if you have it. The soup is always appreciated. The light is always on somewhere. You just have to walk toward it. See you on the next one. And if you've read this far, if you're still here at the end, then you already know something about yourself. You're the kind of person who stays, the kind who doesn't skip to the end before the story earns it, the kind who lets the slow parts breathe. That's the same kind of person as Ray, as Maggie, as Dale with his loaf of bread in a paper bag and his practice speech he forgot when the door actually opened. We're all that kind of person, somewhere inside. Most of us just need a blizzard to prove it.